Okay, greetings everyone. This is Kali Akuno. It's a pleasure to be with you again. I want to thank everybody for tuning in, and those of you who are going to watch this later, definitely make sure to like, share, and subscribe the video. We're trying to do more of these to inform folks about critical things that are happening in the world that the left, in particular, needs to pay keen attention to in the United States. And today we wanted to circle back around and have a conversation about Venezuela and, more point of fact, about the Bolivarian revolutionary process and where that stands, particularly in light of the threats that the Trump regime and the MAGA movement are posing against the Venezuelan state and its people. So we have brought back Circa to join with us. Folks might recall about 3 weeks ago we did an interview about the impending threat, which has done nothing but escalate over the course of the last 3 weeks. The first round of interviews we did, if you missed that, definitely go check it out. Um, and we also today joined by Chris Gilbert, author. Both of them are authors, but Chris, as many of you all know, is the author of a book that I've been recommending, which I'm going to put up now, which is Communes or Nothing. If you don't have it, get you a copy of it and read it. And both of them did this issue of the monthly review, which came out a bit earlier this year. It is titled Communes in Socialist Construction. So get your hands on. But yeah, let's get directly into it. There is a cover and a lot of people to get to today. Misinformation that is out there about Bolivarian Revolution. So, and let's just start with an update on where things being posed and his regime, or I should really say Marco Rubio, Marco Rubio, and his long-standing kind of anti-communist crusade that a large part of the MAGA movement have adopted. So, Sierra, if you don't mind, if you just give us an update on where things stand right now.
Well, first of all, thanks, Kali, and to everybody who's listening. It is important, and make a gesture to me if you do not hear me well, because I'm not 100% sure about my connection. Okay, I can hear. That's okay. Um, yes, it is important to be talking about Venezuela. There has been a build-up since a military build-up against the Bolivarian Revolution and the sovereignty of Venezuela. We could say since early August, but actually we should really say for the last 26 years when Hugo Chavez came to power. But I think there are two main reasons to understand, or actually three, to understand why there is this interest, this overt interest from the United States government to overthrow the government. They talk about regime change without any qualms. They've been talking about regime change for the West, more than 2 decades. So the reasons why there is a long-standing interest on overthrowing the government, we could say that one is because Venezuela sits and the people of Venezuela have the largest oil reserves in the world. But actually, that's not enough because Saudi Arabia also has very large oil reserves, and they are not getting a military buildup against them. So the second reason is that this is a sovereign project, a project where the people define what to do with the resources, how to organize themselves. And the third element, which would come later in the course of the Bolivarian process, is that actually this is a project that is profoundly democratic and based on a territorial democracy that we understand to be our pathway towards socialism. So communes, and Kali was mentioning before, Chris's book on communes. Communes are actually spaces from which we reorganize society, in terms of the politics and also in terms of the economic relations, the social relations of production. So those would be kind of like the large elements to understand why there has been this ongoing aggression, which has taken many shapes over the past 26 years, from, of course, the coup against Chavez in 2002, but also sabotages, fascist aggressions against the people of Venezuela, which we called guarimbas, the street expressions of fascism, guarimbas, and an all-out economic war, which was begun in 2015 by Obama with the famous Obama decree declaring Venezuela an unusual and extraordinary threat. So those would be kind of like the large elements. Now the question is, why is there now this military buildup? And it's not a military buildup because there's been more than 50 people killed, mostly fisher folk, near Venezuela, and also, but more recently, in the Pacific coast, in the so-called war against narco-terrorism. So why is this happening? I think that there are, of course, Narco Rubio, as they call him, Marco Rubio, and their anti-communist agenda is an important part of this. But I think we have to look at it from a larger perspective. Basically, the very fact that Trump's movement is called Make America Great Again, that in itself is a recognition that the US is losing, it's beginning to lose its hegemony. If you have to make it great again, it must be because it's not so great anymore. So the very enunciation of this, the very identification actually goes back to the recognition that the US empire is losing ground. So why are they turning more hardly towards Venezuela? Basically because, and towards Latin America in general, basically because it is true that China has more presence throughout the continent. It is a non-violent, non-military presence, with another kind of treaties that are signed between countries, and that is of great concern. And of course, Russia also has a presence, a cooperation rather, between the Venezuelan government and the Russian government in terms of defense. So those would be kind of like the larger elements, but we have to lay them on again, on top of this Miami mafia that is tremendously anti-communist, anti-popular, and anti the people, anti the people of the global south, and specifically of Cuba and later Venezuela, defining their own history. So I think those would be kind of like the larger elements that we can account for why there's this buildup. That's not only a buildup, as I was saying, but it's also people already being killed.
And just to follow up on that briefly, um, they've also begun to threaten Colombia, right? And they're doing now exercises in well, these executions. I mean, they call them. That's what they're using there. I'm not going to use their rhetoric. They're also doing these summary executions now in the Pacific, and it seems to me that it's a direct response to the Colombian government, both offering a level of solidarity with Venezuela, also Palestine, but also just trying to protect the sovereignty of the nations in South America and the Caribbean. So there's a lot that's going on. There's an election coming up in Colombia, very soon, and there's many fears that the right wing will kind of seize control again by hook or crook of Colombia. So if you could help us just kind of understand where relations are at, sit between Colombia, uh, and where relations are at just briefly within the region, because we know, or at least some of us who are paying attention in the United States, Trinidad is taking a very pro-U.S. position and posture. Um, and it seems like CARICOM and some of the other countries, while offering a degree of rhetorical solidarity, don't want or not committing themselves to kind of more formal challenges to the United States. Is that the correct read, or is there more to it that we, the audience should understand?
Okay, so certainly Petro has had a very coherent position in terms of the defense of the sovereignty of the region, really, because this is an attack against the region, as we will see. Um, but specifically Venezuela, and has said that an attack on Venezuela would be an attack on Colombia, and it's true. It's not just rhetoric. It actually there's there's substantive reasons to understand why that's the case. So and then as that began to happen, there were extrajudicial killings again of people of Colombians, supposedly in international waters, but really Southcom gives almost no information of where these bombings happen. But I actually would like to point to something else, and that's they are also doing them off the coast of Mexico.
Right.
So this is the most recent event was off the coast of Mexico, 4 boats. So I think it's important to understand that these are actually, if you look at the continent, other than Cuba, of course, what would be the countries with the most progressive, and in our case, revolutionary governments? Well, it would be Venezuela, but also Colombia and Mexico with Sheinbaum. So you can map the situation on that basis and begin to understand that this is actually an attempt to rebuild a kind of like Monroe Doctrine, and I think that Chris will have something to say about that, to kind of like reactivate Monroe Doctrine in relation to the continent, and targeting specifically the countries that are most sovereign and that aim to define their own history in the continent, in the world.
Right. Right. Well, let's get into that, Chris, and bring some things up with you. I mean, to my mind, I think if for the audience to kind of trace, I would, the Trump regime's kind of order of operations, to me, this go around has been very systemic. It's not random in the sense that the first administration was. And if we go back to the very beginning, I mean, they came out the gate very early on in January and February with attacking, the sovereignty of Panama. And that's kind of been somewhat forgotten or removed, at least from the U.S., kind of dialogue. But that hasn't gone away in any fundamental way. And then there's been very little, at least in the U.S. press, coverage of the different ways in which the Trump regime has threatened Feinbaum in Mexico, both around trade, but also around some of the effort for them to build an alternative route, an alternative canal, which is basically freaked out the United States, not just the Trump regime. I think that's both sides of the ruling class are very disturbed by that. And you have to kind of follow, at least, on my end, is just following kind of a lot of the trade, particularly the seamen and the freight and logistics kind of trade information, to get a sense of how they're panicking in regards to that and how much pressure they want to apply. And this Monroe Doctrine 2.0, I think, has to be put in this broader global context of rivalry with, from their perspective, with China, right? And trying to keep Mexico and the rest of Latin America firmly within the U.S.'s orbit and camp, So if we can get into that, I think that'll be very, very helpful. So turning to you, Chris.
Uh, Thanks, Kali. Sure. I think as we're all talking about, it's really not just the Venezuela's the focus. It's really the whole region, the whole hemisphere. I mean, as you were saying, when Trump got out of the gate, he was already being aggressive in the hemisphere. And another example of that is Greenland, the claim that he was going to buy Greenland or buy with pressure Greenland. And then the threats that Canada will become the 51st state. And then if we reach down to the other end of the continent, there's agreement to put a new military base in Patagonia. So it's really a continent-wide project. And about the Monroe Doctrine, I do think that it's important to see the history of the Monroe Doctrine. I mean, often, perhaps because of a kind of idealism or just as a kind of shorthand that we all use, we tend to think that the Monroe Doctrine is one thing and that it's simply by saying it comes into existence. And it's actually people who know the history of the Monroe Doctrine. There's an interesting study by the Colombian historian Indalecio Giovanni Aguirre, in which he points out that when the Monroe Doctrine was born, it was really just the United States saving face, because it was actually the idea of the British Secretary of State, George Canning. He wanted to keep Latin America open for British interests, and he proposed to John Quincy Adams, who was the Secretary of State of Monroe, that they would issue some statement saying that Britain and the U.S. were not going to permit efforts to other European powers in the region. And to save face, John Quincy Adams cooked up the Monroe Doctrine, which really, in whatever it said, it was really about protecting British interest. And the United States was completely incapable of enforcing anything because it basically had no navy, no significant navy. So when people really think about the Monroe Doctrine, they're really thinking about this moment in which it kind of becomes activated in the name of intervention, and that becomes a possibility precisely because of U.S. imperialism. I mean, Lenin puts a date on imperialism. It more or less emerges around 1900, and that's when Theodore Roosevelt is the president of the United States, and he's as the Roosevelt corollary, which allows for essentially policing in the area in the name of U.S. interests. And when we say imperialism, obviously imperialism is a political, military, but also an economic thing. So it's essentially protecting U.S. monopolies. For example, centrally, the United Fruit Company, in the period 1900 1934, the U.S. did interventions in Panama. It instigated the separation of Panama from Colombia. It intervened in Venezuela when Cipriano Castro was president. And then it moved to Dominican Republic, to Haiti, to Nicaragua, where the Nicaraguans put up a very impressive resistance. And so I think one interesting thing we think about, I think we're in a similar moment. And as we've been saying, like, why are there gunboats going back in the Caribbean again? And you don't put gunboats in the Caribbean if you don't assert your power if you already have power. So essentially they're asserting their power because they're losing, as Cira was saying, that you don't make America great again if it's already great. So it's an effort to reassert power. And precisely that's because for a number of factors, there's greater sovereignty in the region. There's been a long process of building up in countries like Venezuela. There's been efforts at regional integration. And so I would say in a great measure, and as well as the emerging multipolar world and the support that arises from that. So we're kind of at a similar moment. And one thing is interesting, I think it's correctly, John Bellamy Foster of Monthly Review wrote a very interesting article called The New MAGA Imperialism. And it's interesting to think about what kind of imperialism the Trump regime promotes, because it went in both periods, they've always claimed to be America first. That would be the United States first in our language. America first, United States first. And there's always been the suggestion that they might be more isolationist. But in fact, they continue to be imperialist, just in a different way. It's kind of like imperialism without hegemony. They believe that the MAGA bases believe that the old kind of imperialism, which is liberal globalization, is too expensive. And we're doing gifts to the other people. We're giving them democracy and giving them power and giving them some aspects of hegemony. They consider Europe parasitical. And so Europe has to ante up into NATO. And so the new kind of imperialism is more directly transactional. It's more like what Amilcar Cabral called piracy on dry land, or in this case, piracy in the water in the Caribbean. And actually, we're seeing that today. Piracy in the Caribbean. U.S. pirates, U.S. corsairs are coming back. So it's more about just seizing what you want, what they want. And I think when you look at Venezuela, there's an interesting shift in the discourse. Before they were going to bring democracy to Venezuela. I say that, in quotes, they were going to bring democracy to Venezuela. And now it's more explicitly, actually for Trump, what they want, they justify it in the inverse way. Before they would say, we're going to bring democracy to Venezuela. And we would say, no, they just want our oil. And now they say, no, we just want your oil. So there's a complete shift in the discourse. And we say, no, it's not just the oil. They also want our socialism. So there's been an inversion in which they justify, since they don't believe in gifting things to other countries, they simply just want the oil. And under the cover of drugs, they say it's about drugs. And, one thing, I'm sure you all talked about this in a previous conversation, it's well known, the DEA, the UN, organizations that cannot be accused of being leftist, recognize that Venezuela is not it's not a drug producer at all, and It's not an important trafficking country, but it is an oil producing country, and so it's the kind of shadow war that's going on.
Well, they're dropping, I would say, just within the last 2 weeks in the U.S. media, they're even kind of dropping the pretext of drugs. Like that has become less and less of the focus. They'll bring up some stuff once again, now again, like, well, Tren de Agua, but it's become very clear, and they've made it very clear. Like, no, it's the oil reserves. We don't want Russia and China having it, particularly China. And Marco Rubio in particular, but also J.D. Vance, have been very clear in articulating this is what they want, and have made no bones about regime change, none at all. So, that's the more open conversation within the U.S., which reflects a deep, narrative shift even here, right? Because just, I would say 10 years ago, that blatant level of just open transparency about what the U.S. is and how it operates, they still had to lie to themselves. And that's what, in part, Trump he represents to a degree. There's no lying about what the stated principles and objectives really are.
That's right. I mean, basically, they had to look for a legal framework to do it, to not go through Congress. And that's why they joined NARCO, which would be, in principle, a response to a real crisis that there is in the U.S. with terrorism. And of course, when you join, when you say that this is a struggle or fight or whatever they want to call it, a war against terrorism, that does allow them to go around the Congress. So that was one of the main things. But also there had been a history of, like mostly a Miami cooked up a history of assigning responsibility to the Venezuelan governments, the Bolivarian governments, relating to narco trade. But yes, we all know that it's not the case, and they are even pretty much recognizing it right now. What has been a constant, which I think is important to talk about when we are trying to trace a history here, is that there has been a constant of regime change. And I think that it has to be put in the center, the fact that they have openly talked about regime change, because sometimes we just take it as normal. It's been normalized because they said it so many times that their objective is regime change. And whenever, from Bush to, all the different presidents, Bush to Clinton, to Bush and the Obamas and so on, when they all talked about regime change, it is an overt expression of U.S. imperialism. So while there is, over the past couple of weeks, a little bit more overt expression in terms of this having the goal of taking Venezuela's oil, the actual goal of regime change has been practically stated since day one. And I think that sometimes we lose the capacity to be outraged because we hear something once and again, and then it becomes naturalized. But frankly, who is the U.S. to define, to say that a country needs the regime change? And that goes back basically to the Monroe Doctrine and its most like its 20th century iteration with a corollary. The U.S. does assign itself the role of the police of the police of the world, and specifically of the continent, and that has to stop. Now, I think it's important that we go back to the issue of the continent, how the continent it has responded, right? In some cases, very, very well. In the case of Colombia, and also Sheinbaum has been very coherent, and of course, Cuba and Nicaragua. But the continent, while there have been processes, sovereign processes that have been advancing, and even revolutions, it is also a more broken up continent than say 15 years ago, in the heyday of the Bolivarian Revolution, of the Pink Tide. In the period of the Pink Tide, there were of course outlier governments, but they were outlier governments, and most of the governments were for a sovereign project. And Venezuela, of course, being always under siege, the Bolivarian Revolution being under siege, but having better conditions, was able to kind of like make many of these countries converge around a collective sovereign project for the continent, a Bolivarian project, we would say, from Venezuela. So this moment is not the same. Of course, we all know what's going on in Argentina. You were mentioning, there's elections coming up in Colombia. We do not know what will happen. Of course, we hope that the progressive forces will stay in power. But even Brazil has been very lukewarm. And earlier, like Lula has really been extremely lukewarm. I mean, there's a lot of analysis about what may be going on, the internal forces, but the truth is that for us, it's not acceptable, the very lukewarm position of Brazil. And then there's Trinidad and Tobago, which is our closest. Of course, we have land neighbors, but in terms of what would be the country that's closer to the political epicenter of Venezuela, that would be Trinidad and Tobago, Trinidad. And right now we have seen, as we speak, there is a military despliegue in Trinidad and Tobago with the USS Gramsci there, something that's really extraordinary. I mean, they've stopped all their port activities to receive this massive warboat, and the government of Trinidad has been extremely. I mean, it just totally folded itself to the interests of the United States, and that is of great concern. CARICOM, in general, has been CARICOM is an interesting theme to study, and also of concern to the people on the left, and to the people who believe in the sovereignty of the peoples, because CARICOM was kind of like very united also in this period of the Pink Tide. Venezuela, during the most economically affluent period for the Bolivarian process, was able to promote very, very good exchanges, very solidarious exchanges with the countries of CARICOM. More recent years, Venezuela, because of the U.S. unilateral coercive measures, has not been able to offer oil. But also there have been changes, kind of like shifts in the governments in CARICOM. So we have seen kind of like a lukewarm response to the current situation. That is of concern, but of course the countries of the Caribbean are small countries with precarious sovereignty. So I think it is important at this time to kind of like think about pathways to reactivate the CARICOM as a space with its own sovereignty. Of course, that cannot be done from outside, but it is something that is kind of like an urgent matter, because these brothers and sisters in these countries are also suffering the impact of these U.S. or pro-imperialist governments in some cases, and in some cases governments that are not able to stand up to US imperialism. So that should also be of concern to us when we think about the situation in the region.
Before we dive a little bit more into the Bolivarian Revolution and where some things are at, I want to ask both of you, because it's just occurring to me, a level of concern that I know myself and several comrades I was talking to just yesterday about the kind of number one, this massacre that happened in Rio de Janeiro. That the Rio that how Brazil is governed, as I understand it, like the police. There is a federal police, but the police fundamentally are the control of each kind of individual state's province, and so this was that state's primary decision without a major consultation, with the Lula government to go in and execute, folks. It's just these summary executions, and that this was a move in particular by the right to put more pressure on Lula to compromise. But to me, and I think to us, it was also in light of what happened with Milei winning in Argentina, which I have to say I was very disappointed to see and to witness, and I've been wondering what kind of threat that poses to the continent on a whole. But it just seems to me like the right is they're coordinating very specifically with each other. They're trying to press, their advantage, and that this one seems to me, this massacre that happened in Rio was done with kind of a clear connotation of what should happen in the United States, and it's something that Trump is trying to mirror, given how the history of how the military has been used as a containment force in Brazil, and it's something that he's trying to copy, in the United States actively now, despite there being some pushback both from the movement and the courts. He's moving forward with creating his own army with ICE. He's moving forward in moving military units, we're finding out, to be these kind of rapid deployment forces, not just those that are kind of housed or that were allegedly just being housed. I'm forgetting the term right now with the National Guard, but the actual active military units. Then there's these reports that a good number of his cabinet ministers are now relocating to military bases inside of the United States and making their primary residencies there. This one in Brazil really was concerning, that it kind of perhaps is foretelling what may come throughout the rest of Latin America, but also in the United States itself. And just what are you all's thoughts on that, seeing it from a different angle, different position?
One thing I would say is that it's important that we just identify that the United States is actually entering the MAGA movement's a fascist movement, and we're seeing many expressions of fascism in the United States. Maybe in Trump's first term, people might have to qualify and at least try to argue the point. But right now, you have the Gestapo, you have Gleichschalten, which is the process of making cultural institutions more homogenous, which the Nazis did and Trump is doing. So it is a fascist system. And it's also typical that I think in an imperialist situation, which has been our situation for 100 years, fascism typically learns from the colonial situation, brings the colonial situation home. Right. So, I mean, to look at a very recent and pertinent example of that, there was against the Cuban Revolution, there emerged Cuban fascism, and Marco Rubio is part of that Cuban fascism, which now the chickens have come home to roost in Washington. And that pattern repeats over and over again, like a lot of Vichy collaborationist French government. It was very powerful in French colonies first. In fact, almost all the French colonies, except for Guinea-Conakry, went over to the Vichy regime just right from the bat. So the colonial situation is essentially fascist already, and it's kind of like the chickens coming home to roost. Mm-hmm. The Brazilian massacre is terrible, And it obviously echoes what's going on in the Caribbean, because there are also extrajudicial executions in the name of allegedly fighting drugs. And you're right that the right wing learns, and I don't know if it's exactly coordinated, but they probably sense the wind is blowing a certain way. There's a certain opportunity. And it's one thing that we've been saying is that the U.S. interference happens in the whole region, but not only against sovereign nations, also against countries with limited sovereignty. The clear case is Argentina today, because Trump directly intervened in the elections by essentially extorting the Argentinian people with the possibility of withdrawing the support of the peso, and then the country would enter into an inflationary spiral. So that's a case of direct intervention in an allied country to guarantee the continuance of a Trump ally there, a clearly fascist Trump ally. The Rio massacre is terrible, and one interesting thing about it is that that was Comando Vermelha. Comando Vermelha is a group that was born in Brazilian prisons, and it initially had a political leaning, a leftist, as the name indicates. Red Commando. They initially had a leftist leaning, perhaps similar to some collectives here, which we call them colectivos, and sometimes they move along the left-right spectrum, and sometimes they can actually express popular desires. As I understand it, Comando Vermelho was an organization that did sometimes implement governability in the barrios in a way that was acceptable to people, that was, expression of a kind of popular sovereignty. So this is kind of like an attack on the people of Rio, on the poorest people of Rio. And of course, that's the way people understand it there.
Yeah, I'm glad you bring that up. Go ahead, sir.
No, I was just saying, as of course, the occupation of U.S. cities is a new phenomenon, right? And it in the U.S., just kind of like picking up on something short, briefly on my part, the occupation of U.S. cities in the in the current period is actually something that happens often in countries of the global South, where right-wing governments are in power. So just kind of like picking up on this thread that Chris was putting there, how in the moment of crisis, in an imperialist context, the violent tactics that are every day applied against the people of the global South, especially when they reveal against oppression and domination, get little by little, like translated to the country of the global North, in this case to the United States. So indeed, what happened in Rio is truly horrible, and it's very painful to see it, but it is also a kind of like a knock in the door for the working class and for Black and brown people in the US, because of course the situation is already very, very bad because of ICE, but it actually can get worse. And I think people should be aware of that. The situation can and is most likely to get worse if people do not organize.
No, I think the plan on this definitely to get worse here. Literally the Republicans are holding food hostage, just straight up using food as a weapon. Tomorrow, all of the Obamacare new premiums, the new agreements that people are supposed to sign to continue, with their medical coverage under those programs, they're going to issue their new premiums by every kind of accounting measure. They're going to be double or even triple what they were, just a couple of days ago. And the Republicans are well aware of what they are doing, and they are doing it very intentionally to break the will, of some very significant sections of the working class, particularly the Black and brown working class, with some disregard, for the white members of the working class, which I think they think that they can, kind of offer piecemeal support to. Some states like Louisiana, for instance, are trying to figure out ways to continue on with the SNAP benefits on their own, but coming up with some very selective criteria who will be able to get those. Other states are trying to, comply. Trump is also talking about offering aid to farmers in the Midwest, also which would be done in an openly, blatantly racist, manner as to who gets aid, who doesn't. And if it wasn't even more apparent, just so the audience will know, hopefully most people are aware of this. They said that they're going to limit the number of refugees. This is the Trump administration yesterday. Limit the number of refugees to 7,500, and they were going to give priority to white South Africans, to the Boer community, as we would once say. So they're very blatant at this point about what they're doing, and the key point is they don't care, and they are fully, I think, gearing up. The one thing I will say, Chris, we don't know. I would agree with you. We don't concretely know the degree to which they're coordinated. Those are things we typically have to find out. But I just want to put out there, like what we have now learned in the last, say, year and a half about the level of coordination. Just to cite a different example, the level of coordination that the United States is actually doing with the Zionist regime, right? Even so much as just a couple of days ago for, Netanyahu threatening that if they didn't return, some bodies, that he was going to implement a strike. Well, he implemented the strike, and they then, came out and said, "Well, yeah, we coordinated with that with the United States," and Trump gave the green light. And then, but we killed a couple of, well, I think it was 120 people they wound up killing that day.
That's right.
And then said the ceasefire's back on. We could just wipe out folks. And I'm mentioning that because I think if we study some of these things, the level of coordination where they are at is actually is becoming much more transparent, and it's actually global. And what's making me think about this, to just put a lot of things together, is this recent RSF attack that happened in Al Fasher in the Sudan. And the information is now kind of trickling out as the level at which the UAE and the United States and Great Britain and France have been arming the UAE to supply weapons really to both sides in that conflict, but particularly to the RSF, and the level of actual knowledge and coordination they have to kind of keep this going, in the level in which they're compromising. So in that case, they're saying, well, you guys gave us help to deal with the Gazan situation in terms of UAE. We're going to kind of offset that by allowing you to have more permission to do what you want to do in the southern part of Sudan, to extract gold and other precious metals, as a trade-off for your collaboration in the struggle. And I'm just thinking, and this part is speculation. The other parts we more evidence is directly coming out with. The piece that I really want to just hone in on is the level at which Trump openly was intervening in the Brazilian judicial process, right, to try to protect Bolsonaro. And my read on this is, okay, I lost that round. Bolsonaro was sentenced, was in prison, but I'm going to find different ways to support other candidates on the right to implement what they want to implement, to force Lula and Brazil to comply in the way that we want them to comply. And I don't think it's by accident that part of that motion came after or during the process of knowing that they were likely, this is to be in the Trump administration, they were likely going to lose this vote, which they did in the Senate, around imposing tariffs on Brazil, right? Which is a core part of them kind of saying, hey, enough is enough. This is disrupting, the economic well-being of core parts of at least our base and people. We have to be somewhat accountable to this being the Republicans to maintain our seats, to maintain our position. So I don't, again, this is speculation on Khalid's part, but I don't think, to me, the way the fascists are moving, I wouldn't put it past them to have direct conversations around, make these moves, execute this, apply, maximum pressure. And clearly, as we've seen the last 2 years, 2 years and some change now, we are in a period globally where life basically the life of the working class is worthless, is meaningless to these regimes and to the bourgeoisie and what they're trying to execute during this period. And so I wouldn't put it past them. And I'm saying this and going over this point because I still think there's too many folks on the left who are maintaining illusions about the nature of the bourgeois institutions in the United States and how much of a kind of a guardrail or a protection they're going to offer to the movements here in the United States and abroad, right? And I want us to divest ourselves because we need to be clear about what type of movement we need to build to defend ourselves from the fascists, and then on the other end, create the new world that we want, need, and deserve. So that brings me back to where we are at with the Bolivarian process. And I just want to open up, very clearly, let's have a conversation about what many now are calling kind of the dead end of the Bolivarian process on certain sectors of the left. The right is totally pushing this narrative that the Maduro government is a dictatorship, is completely anti-democratic, and therefore everything associated with the Bolivarian process, the communes, the cooperative, everything in between, is now tainted from their perspective by this cast that there really is no Bolivarian process anymore, and it's just a dictatorship that's coming on high from the Maduro regime and the military, which is backing, quote unquote, the Maduro regime. Let's attack that and dispel that if we can.
You go, Chris, if you want to.
Sure. When you said this thing about everything going bad in Venezuela, I was reminded of 10 years ago in which a large part of the, I hesitate to say it, left, alleged left, I don't know how many qualifications I can put on that, was started to talk about the end of the cycle. And they all quickly turned themselves into it was like a funeral. Like the whole Schadenfreude fest in which they delighted in what they thought was the end of the process. It was really a bizarre phenomenon. Like, because of a few setbacks, everybody started to look for how they started to preach about how the process was going down and everything was ended. And I couldn't help wondering, realizing this is the most extreme example of Eurocentrism. Meanwhile, the very same people were holding on to the barest thread of hope in their own countries, whether it was Podemos or Bernie Sanders or something. And so why is it that in one's own country, one holds on to the barest thread of hope, and then when it's some other country that isn't able to do the immediate revolution, the immediate, complete, permanent revolution, then it's immediately thrown in the trash can. So it's amazing how people accept these stories, and I think it's shameful that a lot of the left has not been able to overcome that. In fact, in the last 10 years, of course, there was a very difficult period here in the middle of, from 2015 to 2020, but the process has recovered in a great measure. And really, there's been a turn to the left, turn towards socialism again, a lot of emphasis on the commune. And the other thing that if you think from the present, I think in the last 2 years since Israel and the United States have been carrying out the genocide in Gaza, we've had lots of object lessons in what imperialism is, what you were pointing to. We could call it the exterminist phase of imperialism, which they'll just exterminate people for their purposes. So in the face of this current situation, we can understand, what is it? That I have to say is the real authoritarianism today. The real authoritarianism is the United States able to decide life or death over anyone. They believe they can decide life or death over anyone on the planet. It's essentially colonial law. I mean, in colonies, the colonial power always said it had the right of life or death over citizens. And right now, the United States proposes to be the universal colonizer, in which it can just say who will live and who will die. And so when some country says it will try to establish sovereignty, or some people in a country tries to establish sovereignty over its, faced with this incredibly barbaric power, colonial power, then everybody calls that authoritarianism. When a country tries to establish some index of sovereignty, as a people tries to establish some index of sovereignty, whether it's Iran, Venezuela, Cuba, that's all called authoritarianism. When it's really just the effort to have authority, some limit, in our case, a very democratically established authority over an area. So the terms are extremely inverted, and I think that people fail to see the forest through the trees. I mean, maybe some people who criticize Venezuela for being allegedly authoritarian, they actually understand what imperialism is, but then they keep two kinds of bookkeeping. On the one hand, they understand imperialism, exercising life and death over everybody on the planet. And on the other hand, they don't recognize that you have to have a certain level of sovereignty to confront that. They don't bring the two things together. So we have a democratically established sovereignty here, and only in a world that's completely turned upside down would that be called authoritarianism. So those are just like the conceptual clarifications that I wanted to enter into the discourse. And to say that we're, in spite of the aggressions, we're in a good moment in Venezuela in terms of the political process. There's a lot of enthusiasm here. There's a lot of hope, and there's been a lot of progress.
Yeah, I guess going along the line of what Chris is mentioning, first, because people who are listening to us may be wondering how people are living the current situation. In terms of the current situation, President Maduro has said, in terms of there's maximum pressure, and our response should be maximum preparation. But at the same time, people have to go on living their daily lives, and school year just began a few weeks ago, and everything began normal. And if you look out in the window, you will see people going about their own life. And that actually, I have to say that that's a victory of the people of Venezuela, Venezuelans, that with this military buildup, and we are talking about when the next when the USS Gerald Ford comes here, which is one of the largest airplane carrier of the U.S. Navy. It's on its way here from the Baltic. When it comes here, the U.S. will have around 10,000 troops around us, and a tremendous amount of assets near us. So first, that's how the current situation is at the moment. But also people are enrolling voluntarily in the militia by the millions and preparing to defend. And the fact that people are enrolling in the militia by the millions is actually an expression of the stability of the process and of the government. People would not be signing up for the militia if there wasn't, because the call came from President Maduro, if there wasn't an affinity between the people and the government. So that's one thing that I want to highlight. But then, in addition to that, look, when the sanctions were imposed by the United States, which is it really is a war without bombs. Like sanctions. When sanctions came around, and in the first years there wasn't enough food or medicine to go around. That's not the case anymore. There is enough food and medicine to go around. It's not that the sanctions do not have an impact in daily life right now, but some of the problems have been overcome over the years. So when the first years of the sanctions came in, it actually was very the government had to assume a certain pragmatic mode of governing. Because it had to respond to this tremendous economic war from the United States. And so in that period of time, there were some moments when the grassroots movement had some criticisms of the government. But things have been changing, and have been changing in a very wonderful way. I actually would dare to say, first, communes, which are maybe we'll talk a little bit more about communes later, but communes are the territorial way of making socialism in Venezuela, with two legs, direct democracy and social control over the means of production, right? So communes began to emerge with force around 2016, 2017, in the worst of times. And they began to emerge relatively spontaneously around the country, or rather re-emerge, because Chavez's project of the communes comes from 2009. But it was in the worst of times when people really began to turn towards the communes. So the communists began to become kind of like a moral referent, we could say. It's a strange word, but that's what referente moral is, the word that we often use here in Venezuela to refer to the communists, to this process that happened in the very early years of the US blockade against the people of Venezuela. So the government has done, I think we could say, even a self-criticism in the sense that it has turned towards the communes. Now, communes are profoundly democratic initiatives. I mean, they are there is liberal democracy, which is a very restricted democracy. As you know, in the United States, you can choose between the Democrats and the Republicans, and really, what big difference does it make? So that's not really a substantive democracy. When we talk about Venezuela's democracy, we do not only have a liberal formal democracy, which we do, where the president and the representatives are chosen, but also there is a grassroots democracy where people decide things that pertain to their everyday life, but not only to their personal everyday life, but they collectively imagine, people, us in communes, imagine collectively how to reorganize the whole of society. So I think it's very, going back to your question, Kali, I think it's very, very, very sad, frankly depressing, that some sectors of the left are looking at this moment as the moment in which they'll make the break with the process. It's actually absurd. Are there problems in the Bolivarian process? Yes. There's problems in the revolution. There's many problems in the revolution. External, of course, because of U.S. imperialism, and of course internal too. Errors, mistakes get made. People are imperfect. There's different factors within a revolution, within any revolution, and sometimes, like more centrist factors have more space, and other times more revolutionary factors have more space. It will happen in this and any revolution. But what I find like really sad, frankly depressing, is that at this point, when actually the government is walking hand on hand with the communes, which wouldn't be the case 5 years ago. In this moment, when the government is actually walking hand on hand with the communes, it's when some people, because of whatever, like some interpretation that they have that comes from the mainstream media about what happened on July 28 last year during the presidential elections, which the mainstream media has been saying the same thing about Venezuela's elections for the last 25 years, like that they are not truly democratic. Because of that, they aligned themselves with imperialism, because these sectors of the left that are overtly going against the Bolivarian process are aligning themselves with imperialism. They are not aligning themselves with the people of Venezuela. They are aligning themselves with imperialism. And this should be very clear. You can like more the Bolivarian process, like it less. You can have criticisms of it. All that is fair. But what is true is that if you align in a moment when there's a direct aggression against the people of Venezuela, if your discourse kind of like builds up on the discourse of U.S. imperialism, then you are the enemy of the people of Venezuela.
If you can explain how in the last 5 years this relationship is kind of forged. I know you talked about, like kind of doing, if you want to call it, excuse me, like special period after the most extreme forms of sanctions were put on. But I've read about it, about how things have grown in this regard over the last 5 years. But I think just what were the steps, and then how are the movements themselves, the communes themselves, kind of adjusting to the shift in this relationship. I think that's a critical thing for folks to understand, and particularly like given our experience in Cooperation Jackson, where not exactly a commune, but definitely a municipalist kind of strategy and orientation, where we had some major differences, with the administration, but still tried to stay within the overall framework of like the Jackson Kush plan. And there was a lot of nuance in where we had agreed and disagreed that was often missed by outside observers that kind of pitted or tried to pit one process as being legitimate and one aspect of the process that we were trying to implement as being ultra leftist or, unrealistic or not practical. And I think there's some critical lessons that as you mentioned, like to me, how I've put it and felt it in real time with dealing with aspects of the left of the United States, like you're more interested in actual what you think are the mechanisms of state power of those being elected to be able to wield those mechanisms to kind of give a broad authority, but not directly invested in the actual building of the people's capacity to govern themselves, right? And like the left in the United States seems to be very much focused on a kind of static notion of the state, particularly the bourgeois state, and a deep divestment in the actual capacity of the class itself to move, govern, and to create new potentials and new possibilities. And I know I've seen that with my own eyes, over the years of going back and forth to Venezuela. I can kind of see and chart a lot of that happening. And so I wasn't particularly surprised, for instance, of seeing kind of this movement kind of converge back, but also kind of being unaware there are going to be times when tensions will reemerge, and that not necessarily doesn't mean that folks will abandon the overall process, but they will find ways of trying to hold the broader government accountable. And I think that's a critical point that is missed.
One thing that we've always contended with the Bolivarian process is that it was an important way of seeing it was kind of the conjugation of popular power and state power that had been intervened in through a revolutionary way. Now that's a complicated, I would say, establishing a new command structure in the state. These are complicated terms because one has to distinguish between government and state.
Right.
And as I understand it, you all attempted to carry out the same project in Cooperation Jackson with a dialogue between the two. And we always point out that as wonderful, for example, as the Zapatista expressions of popular power were, they achieved nothing like the scale of popular power here. And we attribute that to the use of state power, returning in some way to state power, and having this dialogue between the intervened in revolutionary state power and the construction of popular power from below. And as we were pointing out, after Chavez died, there's a complicated trajectory in which I have to say, recognize that Nicolas Maduro showed his capacity as a leader in these past 12, 13 years, precisely because he did some very important things like maintaining the unity of the process, learning how to overcome the blockade, and then in these last years, turning back to the socialist project, reviving the relationship with the communes. The actual story of the coming together of the communes in the state, that this kind of the overcoming some of the contradictions, I would say manageable contradictions, secondary contradictions between state and communal power, is a complicated one. It has heroic elements like the founding of the Union Comunera, the Communard Union, and then this different processes of rebuilding and coordinating communes. But one thing you can say from both sides, from both the side of the government and the side of the communards, there was always a high level of political maturity and unwillingness to opt for ultra-leftist positions that might help the counter-revolution. And I would say a political wisdom, a political wiseness. So, as the Communard Union was founded, the minister Minister of Communes arrived and received a hearty welcome from the person who was the head of Maizal Commune, and 3 years later would become the minister himself. So there's been this relationship with matureness on both sides. And one important point of inflection was in the lead up to the election last year, the government, one thing it did was it started the consultation processes with the communes, these grassroots consultations, which really have been a wonderful thing for the communes because it makes stronger already existing communes, and it also helps incipient communes. It has reestablishes their relationship with the revolutionary government. And then shortly after that, Angel Prado, who was probably the most famous communard in Venezuela, he was named Minister of Communes. And another thing that many people are aware of these changes, which show a coming together. But there's another element that's also important, is kind of in the background, which is that the pro-business current in the government the strongest pro-business current was associated with Tariq al-Assami, who was the oil minister, and he was charged with corruption, put in prison. So there's the fall on the one side. There's the fall of the most pro-business side of the process, and then there's the rising up of the pro-commune, pro-socialist sector. So it's actually a very interesting moment. I want to conclude with one little thing. I always find it that there's a kind of ultra-leftist position, which I know because I've been guilty of it. The ultra-leftist position, or maybe you could call it the Western Marxist position, which is to only be enthusiastic about revolutions when they're in their moment of glory. You know, the kind of expressed in '68, like, only rebellion is glorious. Only the rebellious moment is glorious. You know, when the clocks stop, or when people live in this kind of carnival spirit. And actually, if you want to find a good expression of the Western post-Marxist vision, it would be Michel Foucault, who celebrated only rebellion, and sometimes and thought revolution was a worn-out term. But revolutions also need continuity of their processes. So it's completely unfair, or it's a form of left defeatism, to turn one's back when that moment of utopian glory and rebellion has to be consolidated. And so that's one thing that we've been victim of here, is that it's been Maduro's historical role to take charge of that consolidation, that process of institutionalization, which is absolutely necessary if revolution is going to go forward, if it's going to be about real power and real sovereignty, real people power and real sovereignty. That requires processes of consolidation. And it's only a kind of Eurocentric, ultra-leftist position, which bleeds over into the liberal position, that doesn't recognize that revolutions need to have continuity, need to have institutions, need to have processes of consolidation too.
Yes, we say at some point, you know, the after the party, the people need to eat. That's the phrase that you know, we've kind of adopted in some of our internal work. And for folks mean, what we mean is, like, you know, that we kind of had a similar kind of couple of euphoric moments where people won the election, but then there was, do we have the capacity to actually, you know, in our context of battling capitalism in conditions in Mississippi, half of our folks were unemployed. Are we going to be able to employ them? Right? And that was not going to be, we weren't going to be able to just manufacture a bunch of new government jobs. So were we going to be able to utilize the mechanisms to open up space so that we could then build cooperatives and communes and new structures that would then create the new conditions that would take care of people's material needs, which may or may not have resulted in a job, but being able to meet people's fundamental needs. And that was like, well, how are we going to feed people? Like, we had the party, yes, we had the celebration, we won the popularity contest, but next week, next year after that, are we going to be able to take care of our people in the grind work that needs to happen over the course of that time to raise people's kind of awareness and the capacity to move a program along? Like, that is a much more difficult, dirty work of trying to build a revolutionary process, which and I can tell you from my own experience, we've seen a lot of people abandon a lot of things when things get a little hard or a little rough, or we don't meet this particular goal, or we haven't met that particular expectation. And people are like, well, you know, this has failed, or you know, it's not as democratic or as I want it to be, or wasn't as inclusive. So we've heard all of that, and then some. And so that's why at certain times there's always a smirk on my face when I've heard people make some criticisms of where things are at. And it just reminds me of one of the lessons I got having gone to Cuba during the heart of the special period, and remembering a debate where some American comrades got into a conversation where they started to try to give their assessment of the Cuban Revolution and what the Cubans did wrong. And I remember they closed their books, and, you know, they listened with grace, but I will never forget, at the end of the day, after listening for about an hour of some seasoned leftists giving their critical interrogation to the Cuban Revolution, they said, That was all. That's all good and well. But when you guys liberate a block in the United States and govern it, come talk to us. Then we can have a real conversation about what it takes and what it all entails.
I think that's a wonderful a wonderful example of what happens. I mean, when you go to the people who are when you are with the people who are really building an alternative in the communes in Venezuela's case, uh, it's not as if people don't know that there are many problems, that we are facing many problems, and that we are facing contradictions, and that we have a long way to go to reach our objectives, which would be collective emancipation. But so if you go to a commune and to an assembly, you will hear, like the criticisms that somebody from the outside might, like think that they are delivering with all their, like knowledge, acquired knowledge in fancy universities or what have you. That's, like I want to talk about the people who are kind of like made a rupture here, who are a very small sector, the sector of the left that has made a rupture in Venezuela, with this rupture that you are maybe kind of like talking about, that's happening in some sectors of the left in the US. The issue is that these people actually do not have any grounding with the people who are actually making a new society, working day in and day out to build a new society. So in my commune, I'm part of El Panal commune, I'm a communard, and when we go to the assemblies, people, if you went to an assembly, you would be surprised by actually the level of criticism of certain responses from the government to problems that the people face. But in no case ever has there, in that I'm aware of, in any really existing commune where there really are assemblies going on in an ongoing way, and not all the communes really have an active assembly-based process. It takes time to build it. In no really existing commune has there ever been any thinking about making a rupture with the government because of the problems that may exist. So I think that it is the people of the working class who understand the real conditions and who understand in this revolutionary process who they should align themselves with, and they understand it because they have the option, right? I'm not saying that the people of the United States aligns themselves with Trump because they are not because they are stupid. No, they align themselves with Trump because they are given very few options. But in the case of Venezuela, where there is actually or they have no options, rather, in the United States. In the case of Venezuela, where people have the option to align themselves with a project, with a process which has also a government, the people never ever think about making a rupture. So whatever, kind of like criticisms that people coming from outside may have, or when they write in whatever their magazines about the problems with authoritarianism and so on in Venezuela, those it's just absurd. It's, on the one hand, it's not understanding the reality on the ground. On the other hand, it's saying to people, it's extremely paternalistic. It is Eurocentric to think that people are not capable of analyzing their situation, trying to collectively correct it, and also being critical when it's necessary. And then ultimately, it again goes back to that they are aligning themselves with US imperialism. And for a country that's been under siege for 27 years, and that right now is facing very probably an all-out attack, imperialist war, that is extremely dangerous. They are playing, they are really sinking themselves in history, because the people of Venezuela, what we are doing is defending the sovereignty of the people and trying to build a better society. And it is not for people from outside, whether they identify as left and have all the correct pathways, or of course for US imperialism, to define our history. And people will fight. I want to say this because we may be coming to an end relatively soon. But as U.S. imperialism closes up on us, there's no that the people are going to not only resist but fight. And actually, if they attack us, like in my organization, we are we are committed to that. If there is an attack on this soil, on this ground, on Venezuela, not only are we going to fight, but it also will be a time to carry forth, like to bring further the revolution in the context of war, which is something that we have learned from history, right? Like there was the Vietnamese emergence of a revolution, but the revolution actually happened with the imperialist attack, and that is a kind of a model for us too here in Venezuela.
Well, I hope it doesn't get to that point, but
Yes.
given given the nature of this regime, I wouldn't be surprised if it went there, and maybe goes there sooner rather than later, as they are trying to consolidate their process and their position to make both internal and external, somewhat advances. And what makes me think that is they're starting to get a little pushback from their own side of the coin. Some Republicans are now beginning to kind of more visibly break, and I think in the course of the next couple of weeks, as the pressure really applies from people being hungry, not having health care, and the vast majority of them being in Republican states, who are going to need those services. That's going to take on a different tone and character. But I think they're still feeling themselves off of whatever they call in this framework from China, the victory that they got in Argentina. Uh, that I think really emboldened them, and then there's a new series of things that should go their way via the Supreme Court, which will just further enable them to strip Black and Brown people of voting access, um, and districts wherein some representation has been able to been secured over most of the last 50 years. They're basically going to destroy that, and then other elements that are just going to give him far more. I'm going to use the word that Stephen Miller used because that's what they're actually aiming for: plenary power over the state apparatus. So I think those things they will try to embolden them to move a little bit harder and faster. But again, hoping it doesn't get to that point. But before we close, um, just and maybe I think we do need to do a deeper dialogue about the communes in Venezuela, because there's not much, at least in the English speaking world, there's not much information that's really out there in detail about how many communes there are, where they are, kind of what they're involved in. And I think that's important for folks here to kind of learn and understand, because even though it's not necessarily some of the same language being used, there is a somewhat spontaneous process of more grounded community, or as you guys would say, territorial projects that are emerging in the United States. And this is really kind of scaled up in a broad way since the pandemic, with the explosion of like mutual aid. And I think there's a lot that our forces here can and should learn from where you all are in the process. Particularly over the last, I think it's been for 20 years now, that communists have been kind of emerging, but particularly I think it's really the last 10 that I think we will be really kind of good to break down. Like these are the steps that took. These are the decision making forms, that are being involved and employed. These are the general characteristics. This is how the federation is kind of operating and working with this how it relates to the government. So I'm just projecting some things I want us to talk about maybe in some more detail. But if you could maybe, 5, 10 minutes, the two of you just break down a little bit of that, and then we'll set a time to come back and do, kind of a part 3, if you would, that really goes into granular detail.
Yeah, we've had the opportunity recently, in collaboration with Kali Akuno, to think more profoundly about communes. We refine many of our ideas. So we've been engaged with the communal project. Specifically, I was pointing out to the monthly review issue, in which there's a bunch of collaborations, all of them very, very interesting, and from different parts of the world, from China, Brazil, the United States. We've asked for perspectives on different communal projects. At the same time, we also tried to refine our theorization of communal projects, I would say with a certain degree of maturity, because I think that one thing we needed to do was to think about a critical perspective on certain communal projects. In my own case, I turned to Marx, and people who know Marx will know that Marx, had criticisms of the Paris Commune, just as Lenin had criticisms of the Paris Commune. You could say how to do it better. Lenin was both an enthusiast of the Paris Commune, but also felt they made important errors. Marx was an enthusiast of the Russian Commune, the Russian peasant commune, but he also realized that it needed to have a revolution that accompanied it. It needed to have a process of national liberation. So an attempt to kind of contextualize communes and revolutionary processes. And I guess with any investigation, or any investigation that's worth the effort, we learned things along the way. We didn't exactly always learn what we expected. But for example, in the interview with Angel Prado, one thing that he reminded us of was that Chavez had talked about a national communal system, making reference to the Chinese model. And that seems especially appropriate for two reasons. One is that we were under this terrible, and we are under, even more so today than when Angel said it, we're under this terrible imperialist assault, imperialist aggression. And then the communes and the unity they provide, the unity among the people, but also the unity of the people with the government, becomes especially important. And so this kind of national communal system has a special relevance. So Chavez initially brought up the idea of the national communal system when he was referring to the Chinese, little Chinese booklet called Building, what's it called? It's about the Chilean commune. It's called Inside a People's Commune. And so that's an element of Chavez's legacy that is especially important to the present, and a way of avoiding this idea of a commune, that any commune goes, or that any commune is a revolutionary project. And another example of like a commune that's absolutely counter-revolutionary colonialist project is the kibbutz. The kibbutz is whatever socialist ideas people might maintain about a kibbutz is a settler colonial project that's functional to imperialism. So it's the absolute contrary of what we need. So we were interested in providing context and providing this political revolutionary framework in which communes should operate. So that's one area we've been developing, and it's, of course, has a special relevance to the present moment.
So I will talk a little bit about the kind of like the basics of communes. I said before that communes are kind of like the basic cell for the reorganization of society, and that they walk on two legs, one which is the assembly, like the political space, the assembly, where there's no representatives, and another one which is that communes should have means of production, because you do not transform a society just with assemblies. It is important to have assemblies and to take decisions collectively to the degree that it's possible. But it is actually important to reorganize the economic system. So communes ought to have means of production, and the kind of property in communes is communal property, communal direct property, social communal direct property, actually, to be more precise. That means that in my commune, which has like 4 or 5 means of production, a meatpacking plant, a plant for making clothing, a soap making plant, and other smaller, and a bakery. So it has those means of production, And the surplus from those means of production does not go to the bourgeoisie, of course, nor to the state, and it doesn't go to the workers either, as in a co-op, but it goes to the whole of the community. So the whole of the community decides again in the assembly what to do with the surplus. Now, for your other questions, how many communes are in the country? Formally, there are about 4,500, a little bit over 4,500, and with the spaces that are to become communes, it would come up to about 5,500 or 6,000 communes. So we are talking about a lot of communes, but we actually think it's important that people understand that it's not that all those communes are really have like a truly, like a truly rich process of assembly, and actually it's a minority of communes that actually have means of production, and we consider that having means of production is fundamental if our goal is to reorganize the society as a whole, which is based on exploitation. So we have to overcome exploitation through having the means of production. So how many very robust communes are there? I would say maybe there are 100, 200 very robust communes where there's means of production, where there's very active direct democracy, where people are really participating. And then there's many communes where there's assemblies, when these consultations that Chris was talking about earlier are called on by the government. And I will explain a little bit more about the consultations very briefly. But when consultations are called, people meet in assemblies. They decide collectively what are their priority problems, the problems that they have to solve in assemblies again. Then it goes to a vote, and then the government deposits funding into the communal bank, and the community itself organizes, so self manages the funds and organizes to solve the problem. So this is a highly participatory and very important in terms of its educational content process. And all 4,500 communes, and actually the extra 1,000 future communes, which are called the communal circuits, all those go through these processes three times every 3 months. So this is actually, even the least organized communes are going through these processes, which, as I tell them, I mean, I'm not telling them with all sorts of precision, but it's, like the people of a community meeting in an assembly to decide what their problems are, and where are they going to allocate the resources that are given to transferred via the government, via the state. That in itself is actually very powerful. But so in all communes, sorry about that. In all communes, you will find this. But in some communes, you also will find means of production. You also will find assemblies to define what to do with the surplus of the excellent. In my commune right now, for instance, there's a process of planification of the communal economy, which is called the distrito económico, the economic district. So we are actually in the process of forming our own democratically run mechanism for planning our economy, which is fundamental when your objective is to transform the economy of a country, and in this case, beginning with a commune. So those are kind of like the different levels. You will find more organized communes and communes that are beginning to be organized, specifically with this really wonderful initiative of the government, which are the consultations, which have been kind of like the motor that was needed to make the communes that were not really active really activate themselves. But then it goes, you were asking about the federation and the confederation. Those are future stages. This is how it goes from communal council, which is a direct democracy space, which has no means of production. Several communal councils make a commune. Several communes make a communal city. Several cities make a communal federation, and then the whole country would be a confederation. This is kind of like Chavez's roadmap for the communes. Right now, we are still at the stage of building more robust communes, and interlinking communes. So I'm part of Alexis Vive, which is a national force that interlinks different communes, and there's the Commune Art Union, a sister organization that also interlinks communes. So we are kind of like in a more we are in a more incipient moment in terms of making the federations and the confederation of communes. And there's different level of development between the different communes, but right now all communes have assemblies on a relatively regular basis because of the consultations. And the consultations are actually the best example of showing that the communal project on its own is really wonderful, but without government, without doing it hand in hand with the government, which is what sometimes these people from the left criticize, this supposed left that is critical of the Bolivarian process. That these consultations are actually the best example that if you don't do it with the government, if you don't, if your attempt to reorganize society does not imply taking power and doing it hand in hand with the government, then you will not be able to advance. 5 years ago, there were practically just as many communes as there are right now. But I would say that it was, and there were some very, very robust communes that were really doing very important work. El Maizal, El Panal, the Che Guevara, Cinco Fortalezas, and we could go on and on. There were some communes 5 years ago that were doing really, really important work. But it's actually the fact that right now there's this alignment between the government and the communes that is allowing the communes to jump forward, to not be, like kind of like spaces where extraordinary things are happening, but to put together a project of not local emancipation, but also national emancipation. And that is really extraordinary. So I think that those would be some of the things that I would like to say about the communes. It would be good to do a conversation more at length. We have been able to not only are we part of communes, but we have been able to visit and spend a long period of time with in more than 20 communes around the country in a work that we are doing, which gets published in Venezuela Analysis, which is Communal Democracy, which comes out in Venezuela as a collection of books that focuses on different communes. And this is a testimonial work where the communards themselves reflect about how they are impacted by the U.S. war against the people of Venezuela, but also how they organize democratically and how they imagine and how they theorize their own practice and how they imagine the new world. So yeah, in the future, it would be very good to do that.
Well, I look forward to it at this set of time, and either right now, I would say the latter part of November, early December, and let's
That's
come
good.
back to it in some detail because there are a good number of people, at least that I know I'm in contact with through some of the build and fight work that we're trying to project, that are asking some of these questions and trying to figure out, how to scale up and scale out on our end. We have a long way to go to get anywhere close to where you guys are, but you got to start from somewhere.
Well, I will say one thing that oftentimes when people look, even people who are solidary, especially people who are solidaries with the Bolivarian Revolution, when they look at us with, like mostly with pain, because there is a fair amount of pain and there's a lot of danger that we are facing. But we also feel very privileged because we are in a context where a new world is emerging. So, and those things actually are not surprising, that we are in a context where there's a real new project emerging, and that we are under siege, and that we are kind of like around the corner from a hot war. Those things are not just a coincidence; they are actually related. So yes, thank you to everybody for their solidarity. Really do align yourselves with the people of Venezuela, with their sovereign project. Listen to the people of Venezuela on the ground. And I will say again, through this series on Venezuela analysis, which is called Communal Resistance, that Chris and I are publishing, you will hear the communards talking about their experiences. And I think that that's really, like, of course, being with Venezuela and its sovereignty is good enough for it's good enough from a left standpoint, but also understanding what people are building will help you actually be more will people to kind of like feel it closer, feel what is going here closer, and then the solidarity will be stronger, because we too, the people of Venezuela, are very aware of the attack that the people of the United States, of the working class of the United States, and especially Black and Brown people, are undergoing. And solidarity has to go, of course, back and forth. It is important for us to not understand the people of the United States as the aggressors, but the representatives of the bourgeoisie, of the elites of the United States, are the ones who are representative, and we understand the people of the United States to also be the victims of U.S. imperialism. And you actually, like the police, the armed forces that are actually on the ground, they are right there, right now. So our solidarity goes to you.
Thank you
Yeah.
for that. We're going to need it. Chris?
Oh, I was just going to say that I recall that I think it's John Quincy Adams said that he thought that Latin America might be the ripe fruit waiting to be picked. And I can assure people that, for not only because it's a multipolar world in which the United States doesn't have total hegemony, but also because of the rich articulation here, including the articulation, the connection, the force that's been built in the commons. It ain't a ripe fruit waiting to be picked any longer. So I think it could be a graveyard for imperialist adventurism. And I also wanted to echo what Sita was saying. It's what you were saying, Kali. That this is counterinsurgency. What you were describing about the coordination around the world is counterinsurgency. The way they brought Cubans in to kill Che Guevara.
Right.
When in Bolivia, so they brought Cuban counter-revolutionaries in to kill Che Guevara in Bolivia. They are highly coordinated, these counterinsurgency practices. And so what I feel that this fascist expression that exists in the United States, when ICE raids your neighborhood, we have the same enemy now. It's the same enemy. So solidarity with Venezuela is solidarity with yourselves.
Yeah. No, that's real about the coordination. So folks should know that many of the tactics that are employed are tactics that they, are wholesale adopting, from the Israelis. That the Israelis have come to the United States, and folks, going over there to learn these kind of crowd control tactics. A lot of the technology that they're using now to surveil people's social media and to track your phones were designed by the same Israeli forces that they've been using to kind of identify Palestinians and kill and attack them with drones over the course of the last 2 years of things that they've experimented on in real time and perfected. We have to just be more clear and intentional about building up our own international solidarity and forces. That is where we are weak right now, and one of the things people know that I've been preaching, for lack of a better term, the right has its international. We don't. So it's time that we build one and be serious about it. So we'll keep plugging away at it. Building the relationships, building the dialogue, and keep it going. I'm being called to work on the ground.
Okay.
So I want to thank the two of you for taking the time,
Thank you,
particularly in
Kali.
times. If anything happens, give us a call so we can kind of do some real-time reporting. But solidarity to the people of Venezuela, to the ongoing revolutionary process. And let's make sure that we beat back, U.S. imperialism in these days and times.
Sounds good, Kali. Thank you, and our
Thank you very
solidarity
much.
goes
Yeah.
back.
It's reciprocal. Yeah.
All right. Thank you. Take care, everybody.
Ciao. Okay.